So, is Willoughby in Sense and Sensibility actually a terrible villain? Or has he just been misrepresented? He's just kind of a romantic that has a bad rap. That is what we're going to be discussing here into today's video. His seduction of Eliza Williams and the multiple interpretations of that in Sense and Sensibility. So if you want to learn all about that, then definitely stay tuned for today's video. My name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where we talk about history and literature. If you like either of those things, please subscribe. So in Sense and Sensibility, Willoughby does multiple things that makes nobody like him. First of all, he breaks Marianne's heart, and then he goes and gets engaged to Miss Grey just for her money. But then his darkest crime comes out, which is he has seduced a 16-year-old girl, got her pregnant, and then abandoned her. And this 16-year-old girl is none other than Colonel Brandon's ward, Eliza. So, of course, we hear two interpretations of the seduction of Eliza Williams' backstory, one from Colonel Brandon himself and one from Willoughby, where it's portrayed in a slightly different light. So the first time we hear the story of Eliza Williams' seduction is from Colonel Brandon. And of course, here is how he describes it. He says, Willoughby had already done that, which no man who can feel for another would do. He had left the girl whose youth and innocence he had seduced in a situation of the utmost distress, with no creditable home, no help, no friends, ignorant of his address. He had left her, promising to return. He neither returned, nor wrote, nor relieved her. And so this instantly gives us this knowledge that whole time earlier in Sense and Sensibility, when Willoughby has been there flirting with Marianne and making the whole Dashwood family love him, there was actually this girl out there, Eliza, falling into worse and worse poverty as she became heavier and heavier with his child, that he's just abandoned, right? He's like basking in Marianne's smiles and love while this girl is literally suffering. And so we can see why immediately it's like, yeah, Willoughby, he's a terrible guy. However, you know who doesn't entirely agree with this interpretation of the story? Mr. Willoughby himself. So fast forward in the story to when Marianne is very sick, almost on her deathbed, and Willoughby shows up because he is convinced that he's going to clear his name before Marianne dies so that she doesn't die thinking poorly of him. In speaking to Eleanor, he says, "What I felt on hearing that your sister was dying, and dying too, believing me the greatest villain on earth, scorning, hating me in her last moments, for how could I tell what horrid projects might not have been imputed? One person, I was sure, would represent me as capable of anything. What I felt was dreadful. My resolution was soon made, and at 8 o'clock this morning I was in my carriage. Now you know all." So here Willoughby is like, I am sorry, I have shown up to clear my name because Marianne is not going to die thinking I'm the biggest villain on earth. I'm not that bad of a guy. And you know that one person, Colonel Brandon? Yeah, he's not impartial. As we see in the same scene, he also says, when Eleanor's like, hey, what about that Eliza Williams seduction thing? Remember from whom you received the account. Could it be an impartial one? That's right. Colonel Brandon's account of this is not to be trusted because he's not partial. Unlike Willoughby, I'm sure Willoughby is very impartial in this situation. So here we see this issue developing of, did Colonel Brandon give us a reliable picture of Willoughby's character, or is he actually misunderstood and not that bad of a guy? And it's very interesting because, of course, part of the issue in this entire scene is also involving the question, was Willoughby planning on seducing Marianne, and what were his intentions towards Marianne, their entire relationship? Now, that is such a complex question. We're going to have to deal with that in a different video. However, right now, we're going to really hyper-focus in on the whole part of the drama involving Eliza Williams and her seduction. And I think in order to really understand that, we need to learn even more about seduction in the Regency era. But first up, a word from this video's sponsor. Thanks to this video's sponsor, Son de Fleur. You guys know that I love Son de Fleur's sustainable, slow fashion styles made out of their OEKO text certified linen. Their dresses always make me feel like a princess, or at the very least, like the heroine of an Agatha Christie novel set off to solve a murder while looking timelessly chic. They pass my twirlable skirt test, which is essential, and they also have pockets, which are important if you are going to solve a murder mystery. That is where you can quickly stash any clues you find. Now, their linen is also breathable and hypoallergenic, and their dresses are so high quality that I feel like I'm wearing a piece of the past, where craftsmanship was key and clothing was meant to last for years. So if you would like to feel like the heroine of your own story, then definitely check out their beautiful linen pieces in Son de Fleur's new spring and summer collection. And don't forget to use my code 15Ellie Dashwood to get 15% off select items. Now, back to the video. So if you've watched my videos recently, you know that we've been talking a lot about things like seduction and female virtue, and that is because these are foundational to understanding how men and women related to each other in all aspects of their life. A lot of the Regency world was designed around this understanding of gender dynamics around sex and also protecting women from being seduced. Sometimes it can be really hard for modern readers to understand how they viewed seduction in the Regency era, which was more or less a male activity. Men were seducers, women were sort of the victims of seduction. It was seen in terms of pretty much con artistry. So, for example, one Regency-era member of Parliament summed up a family's worries this way. This is what families worried would happen to their daughters when they came out on the marriage market. Suppose the case of the daughter of a respectable family entering the world with all the graces to adorn her station in society. Young, beautiful, and inexperienced in the ways of vice, yet seduced by the arts of a designing man under the promise of marriage. Is it fit this young, inexperienced female should be the principal sufferer? Now, this concept that sex outside of marriage, or seduction, is a man conning a woman out of her virtue is somewhat significantly different from the way a lot of people look at couples sleeping together today. And that is because there's been major shifts in society that have changed the dynamics around sex outside of marriage. And one of those is what we've been talking about in the recent video on Lydia Bennet being ruined. For a woman, having sex outside of marriage carried with it complete and total ruin. This was their entire reputation, happiness, future, family honor, and life that these guys were trying to get from them by sleeping with them. Basically, the average woman in the Regency era simply had too much to lose to be freely going around sleeping with guys. They had to more or less be seduced or conned out of their virtue. As one Encyclopaedia writer went on quite a tirade about the injustice of all this. The seducers of female innocence practiced the same stratagems of fraud to get possession of a woman's person that the swindler employs to get possession of his neighbor's goods or money. Yet, the law of honor, which pretends to abhor deceit, and which impels its votaries to murder every man who presumes, however justly, to suspect them of fraud or to question their veracity, applauds the address of a successful intrigue, though it be well known that the seducer could not have obtained his end without swearing to the truth of 1,000 falsehoods and calling upon God to witness promises which he never meant to fulfill. The law of honor is indeed a very capricious rule, which accommodates itself to the pleasures and conveniences of high life. But the law of the land, which is enacted for the equal protection of high and low, may be supposed to view the guilt of seduction with a more impartial eye. Yet, for this offense, even the laws of this kingdom have provided no other punishment than a pecuniary satisfaction to the injured family. So this quote talks about the monetary damages a family can go after if their daughter is seduced, like I talk about in a recent video. However, technically someone could also sue someone for breach of contract, breach of engagement. So if a girl was engaged to a guy and they slept together and then he broke it off, she could technically sue him. However, she would have to prove in court that they were in fact engaged. So if the guy is like, we're engaged, but it has to be secret, there's no proving that in court if she never told anyone and he never told anyone and it wasn't well established in their little, community. And so this was a favorite lie of seducers, was promising to marry the girl they were seducing, saying they were engaged, but it needs to remain top secret. So basically, how to survive in the Regency era 101, don't accept private engagements. If a guy wants to be engaged to you, but secretly, no, we don't do that here. And we see here this writer, again, harping on the same issue of there being that double standard where men almost get applauded for this type of behavior by other men. This should technically be against the law of honor, and yet somehow it's not. And you want to know who uses this strategy of promising to marry someone in order to seduce them? Wickham. So in Pride and Prejudice, when Lydia runs off with Wickham, she is fully convinced that he plans to marry her. We see this right from the get-go when she leaves that letter behind for her friend Mrs. Foster. This is what she writes. I'm going to Gretna Green, and if you cannot guess with who, I shall think you a simpleton. For there is but one man in the world I love, and he is an angel. I should never be happy without him, so think it no harm to be off. You need not to send them word at Longbourn of my going, if you do not like it, for it will make the surprise the greater when I write to them and sign my name, Lydia Wickham. So Jane Austen establishes very clearly that Lydia's intention is always to marry Wickham. From before she elopes with him, she thinks he's going to marry her. They're going to get married right now at Gretna Green, and it's going to be amazing. But of course, then they end up in London for a while, but that's okay, because even though, they're living together, he's still going to marry her. Now, Lydia did not just create this Wickham is going to marry me plotline in her head. She's clearly been fed this by Mr. Wickham. However, how does Mr. Wickham view it? Does he feel responsible with what happened for Lydia? Well, here's what he tells Mr. Darcy. Darcy notes that Wickham scrupled not to lay all the ill consequences of Lydia's flight on her own folly alone. So folly in the time period meant want of understanding and weakness of intellect, or otherwise, Lydia is dumb. Wickham's pretty much over there like, yeah, but I'm not really responsible with what happened for Lydia because she's just dumb. She was dumb enough to believe me when I told her I was going to marry her. So dumb. Her own fault. And you'll never believe who is also very dumb enough to believe a seducer's lies. Eliza Williams in Sense and Sensibility. Here is how Willoughby puts it. In defending himself, he says, I acknowledge that her situation and her character ought to have been respected by me. I do not mean to justify myself, but at the same time cannot leave you to suppose that I have nothing to urge, that because she was injured, she was irreproachable, and because I was a libertine, she must be a saint. If the violence of her passions, the weakness of her understanding, I do not mean, however, to defend myself. So here we see Willoughby's like, yeah, I was a libertine. I was a guy sleeping around, but she wasn't perfect either. I mean, the weakness of her understanding, kind of dumb. And he really doubles down on this when he has to defend himself from Eleanor's reminder that not only did he seduce Eliza, but then he left her stranded, abandoned, and destitute without any friends or money. Right? How is he going to answer for that? Well, here's what he says. I did not recollect that I had omitted to give her my direction, and common sense might have told her how to find it out. So Willoughby is pretty much like, okay, I left her, but she could have figured out how to write to me if she really wanted to. Yeah, like I kind of forgot to, not leave her stranded, but she could have figured stuff out on her own if she had any common sense. Again, if she was not dumb. So here we see Wickham and Willoughby operating in very, very similar ways. First of all, they identify girls who are young and inexperienced and also away from the safety of their parents or guardians. So for example, Lydia is in Brighton on vacation and Eliza was on vacation in Bath with a friend. Then they lie to them, right? We see Lydia believing that Wickham is going to marry her. We don't know the entire story of what Willoughby told Eliza, but he doubtlessly told her something, or at the very least, every single look and action very similar to how he interacted with Marianne indicated to her that this guy was genuinely in love with her and wanted the best for her. Meanwhile, these two guys were like, well, I don't really feel that bad. She was dumb to begin with to believe me when I told her all these lies. It's her fault that she let herself get seduced. But what are the long-term consequences for the woman? Because even though many in the Regency era saw seduction as a con artist game, the principal sufferer, as that quote said earlier, is the young woman. She is the one who has her personal value dropped to zero and future hopes of happiness ruined. So what happens if her seducer does not marry her? Well, one writer in the era put it this way. The loss which a woman sustains by the ruin of her reputation almost exceeds computation. Every person's happiness depends in part upon the respect and reception which they meet with in the world, and it is no inconsiderable mortification, even to the firmest tempers, to be rejected from the society of their equals, or received there with neglect and disdain. But this is not all, nor the worst. By a rule of life, which it is not easy to blame, and which it is impossible to alter, a woman loses with her chastity the chance of marrying at all, or in any manner equal to the hopes she had been accustomed to entertain. Now marriage, whatever it be to a man, is from that which every woman expects her chief happiness. So here we see these girls facing rejection, disdain, the complete loss of hope that they're ever going to find love, the fact that they were raised from birth to believe their purpose in life is to be wives and mothers, and now that's done. That is never going to happen. Now, would it absolutely never happen? Of course not, because technically they could legally get married. So if a man came along and was just like, you know what, I am willing to overlook the fact that you were seduced because I'm just so in love with you as a person and I want to marry you, then that guy could marry her. And that would actually seriously help her socially. It was almost like the approval and acceptance of a man gained you some serious social acceptance in the world. However, the chance and likelihood of that happening was very low, especially if you did not have a lot of money. Of course, if a rich heiress was seduced, well, she was still a rich heiress. How even in that situation, people would be like, her husband really only married her for her money. There can be no real respect in that relationship because, Now, if a guy did not just fall madly in love with her or marry her for her money and she remained single, then a few different things could happen. Obviously, like we see over in Mansfield Park with Maria Rushworth, her father, after her divorce, is willing to financially support her. Of course, he kind of sticks her out in a cottage in the middle of nowhere. So she's sent off into exile, but at least she has food to eat, somewhere to sleep, and probably a couple of servants in the house. However, not all families were that generous, and if a woman was left to provide for herself, she would find that being seduced also significantly reduced her opportunities to find work. So it would be very hard for her to go out as a governess because families did not want seduced women teaching their daughters because they thought that would ruin them morally and also bring just questionable morals into the household. However, if someone could get very, very far away. So for example, if you get seduced and you have enough money to get like a one-way ticket to say like Italy or Russia, they'd be very happy to hire English governesses, and it's less likely that your gossip and past will catch up with you. You might need to run away to Russia or Italy if this so happens. Though sadly, the fate for a lot of seduced women in this time period was falling into prostitution. This was highly talked about, and people would look at prostitutes and be like, she was probably a seduced woman at some point. That's how she ended up here. So this is something we actually see happening in Sense and Sensibility. So if you're familiar with the entire Colonel Brandon backstory, you know that Eliza Williams, the girl who gets seduced by Willoughby, is actually the daughter of another Eliza that I like to call Eliza Sr. so we can keep them straight. Eliza Sr. was married, but then she had an affair, and then things did not work out with her seducer, and so basically she ended up falling into prostitution. This is how Colonel Brandon describes it. After Colonel Brandon comes, he tries to look for Eliza Sr. to help her, but he can't find her because, well, as he says, I could not trace her beyond her first seducer, and there was every reason to fear that she had removed from him, only to sink deeper in a life of sin. Sinking deeper in a life of sin is code for prostitution. However, is that what's going to happen to her daughter? Because there is great likeness between her and her daughter, as Colonel Brandon says. Such has been the unhappy resemblance between the fate of mother and daughter. So is Eliza Jr. also going to end up in having to do prostitution? No, because thankfully Colonel Brandon does seem like he's planning on providing for her and had already begun to do so from the point when he discovered her and found her pregnant. However, here is what he sort of says about her fate. Marianne may now and hereafter doubtlessly will turn with gratitude towards her own condition when she compares it with that of my poor Eliza, when she considers the wretched and hopeless situation of this poor girl, and pictures her to herself with an affection for him so strong, still as strong as her own, and with a mind tormented by self-reproach, which must attend her through life. So basically, Colonel Brandon here is saying that Marianne should be thankful that she did not end up like Eliza. Eliza has nothing but a lifetime of self-reproach to look forward to. So as we see, the consequences of seduction for a woman were serious, almost to the point that it's kind of a form of murder. It kills the hopes and dreams she had for her life. It sinks her value in her own self-esteem and in society's esteem. And it's such a serious thing that one author put it this way. He said about seduction, not one half the crimes for which men suffer death by the laws of England are so villainous as this. So basically this guy is like, seducers are out there committing a crime far worse than what a lot of guys are hanging for here. Like, why are they dying? But like, seducers are getting like a pat on the back after they completely destroy these women's lives. And this really goes right along with what Colonel Brandon has to say about the seduction of Eliza. He sums it up this way, that the seduction is that which no man who can feel for another would do. And so basically, Colonel Brandon is pointing out that if a man has the ability to care about another human being, that he can feel for someone else, he can't be out there seducing people. Right? Because the consequences for the young lady are just so terrible. Which just brings us back to the big question of, is Willoughby actually a terrible guy, or has he just been misunderstood? Well, I think after reviewing what seduction meant in the era, the terrible consequences for the woman, the required lying and con artistry, while knowing that you are killing her entire future of happiness, and then blaming it on her for just being too dumb, I don't think it's looking really great for Willoughby. However, I do think that the scene where Willoughby comes back to defend himself to Eleanor is one of the most insightful and carefully crafted scenes Jane Austen has ever written, and that we need to dive into it more in a future video. And let me know in the comments down below. What do you think of Willoughby? Do you think he was just misunderstood? Or do you think England should really reconsider what qualifies as a death penalty and include him in it? Let me know in the comments down below. And also, shout out to my channel members. Hi! Keep being awesome, guys, because you're awesome. Bye!